Hi, I'm Claire, and today I want to talk about science fiction and fantasy recommendation lists, and how not to do them. A few weeks back I was shopping at a brick and mortar bookstore that I like, and I saw this table display that was presented as an introduction to science fiction and fantasy, and it was just really annoying. It was a pretty bad display for a number of reasons, but it was also pretty typical. I see sci-fi and fantasy recommendation lists and best-of lists that have the same issues again and again, so I thought I'd use this real-life example as an opportunity to talk about how we choose books to review and promote, and how some books just end up getting less publicity when they're just as good. So let's have a closer look at this table. We've got 12 books here, neatly sat underneath a sign saying, "Have you tried sci-fi and fantasy? If not, here's an introduction." We've got Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, American Gods by Neil Gaiman, A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin, The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, Annihilation by Jeff Vandermeer, Dune by Frank Herbert, Ready Player One by Ernest Cline, The Strange Affair of Spring Heeled Jack by Mark Hodder, The Man in the High Castle by Philip K. Dick, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury, The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake, and The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy series by Douglas Adams. Now, when I saw this table, there were two things that jumped out to me immediately. First, a lot of these books are just not good introductory level reads to get someone into SFF. And second, that list is very much not representative of the field of SFF writing as it stands today. Or really, ever. Let's put a pin in this last point for now and focus on how these books are just not a very good introduction to science fiction or fantasy at all. There are some really great books on this table, but also books I would not recommend to readers who are new to the genre because they're not particularly accessible to readers who are unfamiliar with SFF. Some of these books are just not newbie friendly. I love Dune and I love A Game of Thrones, but if a friend of mine who'd never read any science fiction or fantasy came to me asking for recommendations, I would not give them Dune or A Game of Thrones to read. There's a ton of really great SFF that comes with a pretty steep learning curve. Books that drop the reader right in the middle of the action, leaving them to figure out pretty complex world building on their own and expecting them to be immediately comfortable with that. And that's because it's what a lot of seasoned SFF readers want to read, myself included. But it can also be really intimidating for new readers. And I know there are people who will look at this display and just see absolute classics, but just because something attained the status of a classic doesn't make it any more readable to someone picking it up in 2018 with no knowledge of the genre. Telling readers new to SFF that they must read specific things because it's a classic does much more harm than good. It gives people a skewed idea of what the genre looks like, and it also risks alienating potential fans. It can be really daunting to be presented with this whole sacred canon of works that you're expected to read just as a point of entry into the genre. Also, if it's classics of the genre we're talking about, where's The Left Hand of Darkness, Dahlgren, Woman on the Edge of Time, Kindred, Her Smoke Rose Up Forever, Imaro, The Female Man? Mind you, I'm not saying any of these books that I've just listed would be good introductory books for a list like this either. What I am saying though is that the defense of, oh, but they're classics, that defense falls apart when you consider that these books are only a very specific subset of SFF classics, and that's classics written by white men. Which brings me neatly back to the point I left over there with a pin in it. This list is super not representative of the genre. All but one of these 12 books were written by men, and there are no authors of color on this table at all. That's just a completely inaccurate view of who is writing in this genre. I mean, really, if you look at the authors on that list as a group, that's so far removed from what SFF looks like that using this set of books as an introduction would mean introducing someone to an entirely different genre. If you want an idea of what the field actually looks like these days, just look at the nominee roster for any big SFF award. The Hugos, the Nebulas, the Clark. These lists do not look like that list. If you look at the publication lists for giants in the field like Tor and Orbit, these lists do not look like that list. And on top of that, very few of these books are actually recent releases. In fact, a full half of them were published before 1980, which, you know, is like several years before I was born, for instance. Only 3 of these books were published in this current decade. It's pretty obvious that this list doesn't make sense to introduce people to the SFF being published today, but it's also not representative of SFF at any time in its history. Speculative fiction as a genre was founded by women. We haven't just popped onto the SFF scene in the last few decades, we have always been there. Similarly, people of color and LGBTQ+ people have always been there, publishing great books, including some books that are considered classics today. And I absolutely get that the bookshop probably has sales quotas to meet, that the staff member who made this table was probably thinking about what books people have already heard of, since we know that people are more likely to buy a book if they've heard about the book or the author before. I understand why this table looks like it does, but that doesn't make it any less of an issue. It's frustrating because it's such a common problem. If it were just one bookshop, it would be easy to write it off, to just start shopping somewhere else as a protest. I wouldn't be making a whole video about it. But the thing is, I see lists like this one online all of the time, titled things like Best SFF Books of 2017, Must Read Science Fiction. So you want to get into epic fantasy? And there's obviously no problem with list posts. Everybody loves a good list post. The issue arises when again and again we get lists that focus overwhelmingly on works written by white men, which reinforce this false image of the SFF genre as an ocean of white dudes with beards and nothing else. Now, I have nothing against white dudes with beards. Some of my best friends are white dudes with beards. But it is a problem when these lists don't include any women, any people of color, or LGBTQ+ people, or any other marginalized identity. It's a problem because these people are here. They're writing and publishing science fiction and fantasy, bloody good science fiction and fantasy at that, but they're not getting highlighted like the books on this table were. And that is crucially important because we know these books are going to sell better by virtue of being on a table with their full cover visible. That is literally why every bookshop around sets up display tables like this in the first place. And again, it's not just this one bookstore. Author Mary Robinette Kowal used to do these informal surveys of the SFF shelves at airport bookstores every time she would travel for work. She found that women were consistently underrepresented, and there's usually really limited shelf space at airport bookstores, so it's not that books by women were displayed less prominently, it's that a whole lot of books by women just weren't stocked at all. As a customer, you just couldn't buy those books even if you wanted to, and that's a whole lot of writers who lose out on potential sales. I found Mary's airport surveys really interesting, so a couple of years ago I started to check on the gender balance of sales on Audible specifically because I use it a lot, and there are consistently more books by men on sale in the SFF category. When I was writing a script for this video, there was a sale going on at audible.com that was up to 70% off. Pretty neat, but at a glance in the SFF category, there were 14 books by men to 8 books by women, and all of the authors included in that sale were white as far as I could tell. That means if you wanted to pick up some audiobooks on sale, where perhaps you'd be more likely to take a chance on a writer that's new to you because it's cheap, then you would have had almost double the chance to start reading a book by a man than a book by a woman, and no chance at all to discover works by writers of color. And it's not that the airport bookstores or companies like Audible are specifically consciously choosing to be bigoted against any writer that's not a white man. Obviously not. It's that SFF has this image of a white male-dominated genre, because again and again these are the people that get highlighted on those best of lists and as the great classics of the genre. Meanwhile, we've got all these forgotten classics, works by women, people of color, LGBTQ+ writers that are just as foundational. Works that should rightly be part of the canon of the SFF genre. Except that these works don't get talked about or promoted or highlighted in the same way, and now are some works we're at risk of losing, of really forgetting, because they're falling out of print. For an author, how much publicity or word of mouth they get is a huge deal, because name recognition is a key part of our decision-making process when we buy books. And so we've got this cycle going on where an author gets talked about and promoted, and that drives sales, and that in turn drives the buzz around this author, this book, and that continues to generate more sales, and the cycle goes on and on. Plus, we often view high sales not only as a marker of success, but also as a marker of quality. There's a reason New York Times best-selling author is such a coveted title. All of this trickles down into the way that we as fans personally engage with books. From which books we decide to buy and add to the never-ending to-be-read pile to which books we actually get around to reading and in what order. And of course, it also shapes the way we talk about books online, which is how we get to all these best-of-year lists that overwhelmingly feature books by men and by white people. Again, it's very rarely about whoever's making the list being actively bigoted. It happens because there are so many books, so many really, really good books, and so little time. If you're not specifically paying attention to the demographics of your reading list, it's very easy to end up with a really imbalanced reading list. I mean, if almost every book you read in a year is by a man, then statistically, it's highly unlikely that your best of the year list will be balanced in terms of gender. And the same goes for reading works by people of color, which is where I know my own reading, for instance, is really imbalanced. That's something that really bothers me and that I want to address in my own reading. And I think there's actually a lot of things, a lot of practical things that we can do if we want to push back against those imbalances. Going back to this table display in particular, what I did in practice is that when I went to pay for my books, I mentioned the issues that I had with the display to the staff member who was working the till. Now, obviously I was polite about it, but I did mention that I didn't think it was a good selection, and that I was really disappointed to see only one token woman out of 12 authors. The person I was speaking to made some points in response which I didn't really think held up all that well. For instance, they said they have more books by women in their dedicated SFF section. But of course you'll only see those if you specifically go looking for SFF books in the SFF section. But honestly, I didn't think it was worth pushing the issue any further with the staff member. I made my point firmly but politely, and then I shifted my focus to making this video, which hopefully will open up this conversation to more people. A practical thing that you can do if you're interested in learning more about this issue is to engage with the conversation that's been happening within the SFF community around this in recent years. Obviously, if you have any questions or opinions, I'd love for you to leave those in the comment section below so that we can start a conversation. But I'm also going to add a bunch of links in the description box below that are relevant to some of the things I mentioned in this video, and I would encourage people to check those out and use them as a starting point for more research. If you follow any women or people of color or LGBTQ+ people on social media who are writers, listen to them and trust in their experiences. But mostly be aware that this is a thing and keep paying attention to it. When you see a recommended reading list with no women, no people of color, no LGBTQ+ people on it, consider pointing out that it's not what the SFF genre looks like. And as I mentioned before, I think we could all do with examining our own reading more carefully, because we all have these ingrained biases. For me, I read loads of books by women, but I know that where I fall short is on reading books by writers of color. I know this, I made it a goal this year that a quarter of the books that I read should be by people of color, which isn't even that much, but honestly, I'm not doing great at this right now. So this is something I know I need to work on for the rest of this year. The thing is, there is so much amazing work to discover in this genre. I'd hate to think that I was reading with like tunnel vision on and missing out on a huge vibrant part of what the SFF genre has to offer. We would be doing ourselves and the whole genre a massive disservice if we didn't push back against the skewed idea of SFF as something mostly written and read by white dudes with beards, because honestly, that's not my experience. That's never been my experience of this genre. But speaking of experiences, I'd love to hear about yours in the comments below. Are skewed lists like this something you've ever seen or noticed? Was it specifically in the SFF space, or have you seen the same patterns happening in other genres as well? What was your introduction to sci-fi and fantasy like? Did you read a lot of classic SFF from before I was born when you were just getting to know the genre? Or even now? And if you've got any recommendations for newbie-friendly SFF, please leave those in the comments below so we can all add a whole bunch of books to our wish lists. If you'd like to see more from me, you can check out a previous video on screen right now. And if you haven't yet, please hit the subscribe button that's on my face for a new video from me every week. I've been Claire, thanks so much for watching, and see you soon.